Ancient truths for a postmodern age. This is Beyond the Stone Table podcast. Now here's your host, John Mosman.
Hello, this is your host of the newly made Beyond the Stone Table podcast, your host, John Mosman. If you have followed me for a while, this used to be the Talking Right podcast. It isn't anymore. I decided that I wanted to go away from politics and mostly center in on religion. I am thinking about also doing a sporting podcast, but that will be later down the road. I do apologize on top of the show here for not airing on Tuesdays. That's what I put as my usual day to do it. Last Tuesday, just a couple of days ago, I woke up with one of the most intense back pains of my life. I couldn't even get out of bed for a while, and it was extremely hard and difficult. And so you can imagine how hard it is to do a podcast, or to put, or to even, write, or to put stuff, or do anything like that while you're dealing with that kind of pain. And I really wanted to bring a lot of attention to this episode, because this episode is going to be dealing with an issue that a lot of people don't talk about, especially in the Christian world. And I acknowledge that most of the people who might find an interest in this podcast are going to be Christian. And I also know that I've got a good group of fans and colleagues out there who also do other podcasts and radio shows that do listen to this podcast, and they are atheists. And they may not understand this point. But I think even what I have to say matters to you, because guilt is something that is a difficult issue to deal with. That is the theme of the show. That's the topic for today is guilt. And what does guilt do to us? And what is the remedy for such a guilt? I think a lot of times people become so weathered down with guilt that they don't realize that their solution to dealing with such guilt is to pretend that it didn't exist. We've kind of seen this exist and become a phenomenon in more progressive forms of Christianity in America right now, right? You see people like Rob Bell, who wants to lessen hell, wants to say there is no hell. You have people who probably grew up in a very fundamentalist and a very kind of hell and brimfire kind of law-oriented church. Maybe they were Baptist, or maybe they were a church that put more emphasis on the law and following a moral law than putting the emphasis on Christ's love and on what Christ does for the sinner, and what his faith is about. I want you to also know that if you stick tuned to the podcast next Tuesday, I'm going to be writing a couple of reviews on some movies that I watched over the weekend. And one of them was the film Little Boy, which I really wanted to see when it came out in theaters. And I watched it, and it was a really good movie. But there were actually things in that movie that I don't think a lot of people knew were interesting things. And so I'll talk about that more. But I only mention that now because I want to bring that up as part of the situation that I'm talking about today. And that is, what it means to deal with guilt. Why do we have guilt? From a psychological standpoint, I guess you could say that guilt is something that helps as a mechanism to help us deal with reality and help us to, avoid us being narcissistic, right? Okay, but there is something more to guilt. Guilt is something that is a deeply held belief when you think about it. I mean, you never see people say, "Well, I think I'm guilty" or whatever. You hear people say, "I feel guilty," and guilty has a huge emotional baggage that it adds to you. So it's a very emotional thing. But there is a sense of about feeling guilt, about thinking you're guilty, about saying that you're guilty, but feeling that guilt. And it's a very gut-wrenching feeling to feel that kind of feeling. Because it makes you feel so bad. And as a Christian, Christians struggle with guilt. And I'm going to make the bold claim that Christians probably deal with more guilt than most people who aren't religious, people who are agnostic. Not that they don't feel no guilt. Okay. It's not what I'm saying. It's a different kind of thing than what I'm trying to say. Obviously, every human experiences guilt to some degree, whether it's guilty for reneging on a friend on a pre-arranged situation that you were, I'm going to go do something with you and you couldn't do it, feeling guilty that you weren't able to provide for your children more, feeling guilty that you might have cheated on someone. Okay, those are things that all humans are probably going to experience or can experience, and it doesn't actually have to be limited to your religious convictions. But there is a sense of guilt, a more deeper gravity of guilt that Christians have to deal with. And when you think about it, and you go, and it goes back to the reason why I named this podcast Beyond the Stone Table and why I came up with that name. Okay, if you haven't heard me say it in the past, the reference to the podcast of it being Beyond the Stone Table is talking about the fact of the stone table that's mentioned in C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. And Chronicles of Narnia is interesting because one of the things it does deal with as a major theme is actually guilt. Right? Peter, the older brother, feels guilt for not believing in his little sister. He feels guilt in not being a better brother to his little brother. There's a sense of guilt felt by all the children. There's an incredible amount of guilt that's felt by Mr. Tumnus when he betrays Lucy. But then there's another greater, big issue of guilt. And that's the issue of guilt that's brought on by the White Witch. What she accuses Edmund to doing. Of course, if you've read the Chronicles of Narnia, you know that it is the witch who actually entices him and actually leads him into doing this kind of thing. And it doesn't demolish the fact that Edmund does, and if you've not read the books, please read the books. They're amazing books. But if you've read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know, where Edmund, he does have his own nature to blame. You see, before they go into the wardrobe, before they go to Narnia, Edmund on the outside, sorry, I said Edward, I don't mean Edward. Edmund on the outside is a bully. He teases. And he's constantly feeling about what he likes. He's a very selfish boy in a lot of ways. And when he goes into Narnia, those what we would consider maybe lesser evils compared to someone that's like a brutal killer or rapist. Okay, but those natures, that natural kind of disposition that Edmund has is made worse. See, he already has a great deal of Aminos, and I'm sorry, I have a hard time saying things sometimes. I do have a speech impediment. Doesn't mean I'm illiterate. Sorry, I brought that up. That I have an issue that someone accused me of being illiterate, and it's not the case. I struggle. I've had for a long time a speech impediment, and it does struggle sometimes with me saying certain words. Okay, so bear with me. Okay, so he does have this hatred, kind of, if you will. He does, when you think about it. This anger about the world, about having to leave his family, of having to live with this person, this professor that he doesn't like, of having to watch and play with his sister who he doesn't like, that he's very annoyed with. He brings all of that animosity towards his sister and his family into Narnia. And the witch, who, yes, if you've not read anything of Lewis and you don't know anything about C.S. Lewis, and don't know that Narnia is actually a book that is kind of a Christian story, it's kind of a, the witch is Satan, Aslan the lion is Christ, okay, these things are metaphors, openly blatant metaphors. But the witch does deceive him. The witch does kind of looks and sees that Edmund is a very greedy and selfish boy. And a lot of the reason why he feels that way is because he's been hurt. We don't know exactly all the reasons probably why he's been hurt as a little boy, but he has been. But what matters most is that it is in his nature to be selfish. He's a very selfish boy. And he's very angry boy. And she takes that and uses that against him. And later, she uses it for her own good and her own mission, because she realizes she can use that to go after Aslan. She comes to Aslan after the children have escaped the witch. She brings Edmund with her and says he's a traitor. Now, if you've ever read the Narnia books, you understand how important it means to be a traitor and how important it means to be a traitor and what it means to be a traitor and the cost of being a traitor, which in Narnia is death on the stone table. She knows that Aslan, being the good-natured lion that he is most likely going to step in his favor. So the boy does have guilt, and I've talked about this, and I'm getting to my point, I promise. The boy has guilt. He does have guilt. But Aslan says to him something very interesting. Not only does he instruct Edmund to not talk about it anymore, go, son, you are forgiven, but he also instructs Edmund's brother and sisters to no longer speak of that action. And from that moment, Edmund is clean by the blood of the lion, by the upcoming sacrifice of Aslan on the stone table. But he has guilt. Now, guilt has an interesting play, especially when you talk about it from a Christian perspective. And if you look in the Bible, you can actually see where guilt has actually played a huge role. We can also see how people have responded to guilt. There's been actually two classic examples, and I think these are good examples to use about how people deal with guilt. There is St. Peter and his guilt. His guilt, his sin, his guilt was to deny Jesus 3 times. He feels the shame, and he knows he is guilty. But he later comes to accept forgiveness. He comes later to understand that Jesus has forgiven him of that sin, and that it no longer is an issue. and he goes on to become the bishop of the church. He becomes one of the church leaders, the big church leader. There's also Judas. And Judas, he feels guilty. Judas Iscariot in the Bible, after betraying Jesus by having, being paid the 30 pieces of silver, throws it back into the face of the people responsible for trying to bring Jesus to justice. He feels guilty, and yet he has a different response. He feels like his guilt is so much to not be accepted. Like, he has done so much wrong against Jesus. He has done so much wrong. He is so guilty that there is no other outcome than for him to take his own life based off of it. He feels so guilty. He's so wayladen with that guilt that he doesn't feel like he can do anything but kill himself. And it's believed by many theologians out there that probably Satan does have a hand. If you kind of see it in the Mel Gibson movie, The Passion of the Christ, you kind of see the devil using the little children to kind of like throw rocks at him, and you wonder if they're demons or not, but to push him into that. But that is something that the devil, like the White Witch in Narnia, does use, is guilt. It's actually one of his favorite weapons to use against us. And the reason why I'm bringing up this issue of guilt today, because I told people on my Facebook that I would actually be talking about this subject that was talked about here on The Blaze. The headline of the story, which is written by Billy Hallowell at The Blaze, says, "Pastor and beloved professor who was outed as Ashley Madison user commits suicide." Now, if you've been following my podcast, you know that I've been talking about the Ashley Madison situation and all these prominent Christians who came out and had been shown to have used her service. Now, if you don't know who Ashley Madison is actually a website that helps spouses cheat on their other spouses. A pastor and seminary teacher who was exposed as a member of Ashley Madison, meaning he signed up for their services. We don't know if he used their services or not. A service that facilitates the hookups between married individuals, has taken his own life. Dr. John Gibson, 56, a communications professor at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary in New Orleans, Louisiana, was among millions of individuals who were listed in the highly publicized Ashley Madison hack. Gibson, a married father of two who was found dead on the 24th of August by his wife, Christy, just 6 days after the publicly leaked information. The information was publicly leaked. "It was a moment in my life that you don't prepare for. I had to call my kids," said Christy Gibson. She told that to CNN Money. She says, "How do you tell your kids that their dad is gone and that he took his own life?" In a suicide note, Gibson mentioned the website Ashley Madison and apologized over the fact that his name had been found in the member list. He also addressed some of the other issues that he has been facing, including depression. And the pastor had struggled in the past as well as other addictions. What we know about him is that he poured his life into other people and he offered grace and mercy and forgiveness to everyone, his wife said. He was a beloved professor and a good friend, and she does not understand how that could have happened, that he could have done this. Now, no doubt, his depression and his mental illness have a huge thing to do with his life and his decisions to do what they did. But the reality is that his life seems to have been dealt this overwhelming guilt. And he says that he feels really guilty in his suicide letter. And I say to him, and I say to people, I say to his family, I say to people, and we see it a lot in the Protestant American evangelical world. This idea of feeling this enormous amount of stress to maintain this moral code, right? We're told we have to be above the sin. And I'm going to tell you this now. You're not above your sin. You're not above your skeletons. You're going to deal with sin. And earlier I said that Christians deal with a different kind of guilt. And the reason why is because we know that Jesus died for us. And yet we struggle with guilt. We see the guilt. We see our guilt. In fact, someone living with Christ, being a follower of Christ, being baptized into Christ, you see that. You feel that. You read that. You acknowledge that your sin did nothing to help you. That your sin separated you from God. And that's a tragedy when you think about it. I'll be right back.
Like what you're listening to? Then visit johnmosman.net for much more.
Sorry about that. I had a little bit of a computer glitch on there, so sometimes that does happen. But going back to what I was saying, and what's important here is to know that things that happen with Christians and dealing with that guilt, that's huge. And it's important that we talk about situations like this, Pastor, and talk about situations why guilt does what it does. And the reality of it all is this. Guilt, its number one aim, especially when the devil uses it, is to completely destroy hope and to destroy your faith. You see, Judas Iscariot was a disciple of Jesus. In a lot of ways, his greatest sin was not his betrayal of Jesus. In fact, Jesus himself knew that was going to happen. If you say anything about Judas Iscariot, you could say that his number one problem is that he didn't realize that the man he had called Rabbi, the man he had called teacher, the man he had called the Messiah, and followed, was the Jesus he knew would forgive him, as he had so many. And sometimes it's hard to think that Jesus, or anyone for that matter, could want to forgive us. We could think that what we're doing is so bad and so wrong and so tough that no one could want to love us. But the message I would have for you is that you're all God's creation. Even in the fallen state, even in your sin, and even while you were still an enemy of God, Christ Jesus died for your sins. And that is the greatest truth. That is the greatest wisdom. That is the greatest message that anyone can relate. That despite our guilt, despite our problems, God still loves us and God still calls us. Some of the biggest heroes in the faith are people who made a habit of trying to ignore Jesus, to ignore God himself. You look at Jonas, and you look at Jonah, and you look at people like St. Paul himself. As St. Paul says, I am the chief of all sinners. And if there's any testament of truth to the faith, it's that Jesus uses the faulty, the ones with skeletons in a closet. And this pastor, I hoped and wished that he would have known that the Jesus that he talked about, the Jesus that he taught and professed about, the Jesus that he believed in, would have told him, and he would have known that Jesus does still love the sinner, regardless of the sin. Still loves the sinner. That he died for that sin, and nothing, even if we sin, one of the worst sins we can possible, Jesus still loves us. And I think part of the problem is, as I said, the evangelical world puts too much emphasis on being a good person and being striving to be perfect for Jesus, but you can't always do that. And Jesus is not there for people who are trying to be perfect. Jesus is not there for people who are trying to do it all right. Jesus is there for the people who don't get it right, for the people who need him the most. He is there. It's a great testament of our faith that the Lord would call people who are the most faulty of people to be the speakers. It doesn't make sense in this world, does it? Right? Look at the whole Kim Davis situation. We're told with that, oh yeah, she's the worst. And I think that way too. Believe it or not. That she's not the best type of person to be advocating that position. But you know what? That's not the truth. The truth is, Jesus loves us all and uses us all.